called the machete by the Portuguese before it was transported to Hawaii.
Really?
The merging of the Portuguese and Hawaiian culture is what led to the ukulele we know today.
Wow, that reminds me so much of the banjo. Walk with me. You see, the banjo has been around since the 7th century. It was originally known as the banjo, however, there are different variations of the banjo that are associated with different African cultures. And it was a mix of the different cultures that eventually resulted in the banjo that we know of today. So sit tight, grab your juice glasses, and let's get into the discussion today about the transatlantic slavery, the banjo, and the bluegrass. During the period of transatlantic slavery, many Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas, the Caribbeans, South America, and North America. But as they went, they took their traditions and their cultures with them, and they held on so tightly to them. Even though it was not acknowledged at the time, these people that were enslaved were humans too. And so in an effort to maintain their sanity, they held on to the one thing that could not be taken from them: their music. They would sing and dance during their pastimes, and the whites didn't really care as long as it didn't interfere with their plantation work. Quite frankly, they even encouraged it. It was profiting for them to have slaves that could play instruments. So those on the plantation fields, they put together several supplies and used them to make instruments, one of which is the banjo, which is known today as the banjo. Accompanied with the singing of improvisatory songs was a gourd banjo that was strung with a gut, horsehair, a thumb string, and 2 or more strings that were long. They held festivals where they danced and they sang and all sorts. Okay, so besides my cringe dancing, that sound that was played was what they called the Negro jig. That sound was born through a mix of different African cultures that came together, plus the cultures of the colonizers, the Europeans. And if you listen closely, you should hear the violin in the background, as well as the claps and the use of what they now call the bones. But back then it was like household items that was used to like make all this sounds come together, and you know, they would sing and dance to all of this. More of this mix can be seen in the evolution of the banjo. The main structural changes in the instrument happened with each major cultural exchange, and we're soon gonna get into that. So in Africa, with the arrival of Islam, there was like a major cultural change because there was the addition of the spiked calabash, and that can be seen in the instrument the molo. So this instrument is mainly from the West African tribes, Yoruba and Hausa. And another cultural change was the wooden lute, and that was formed into like a transverse gourd, and that can be seen in the instrument the akonting. And then in South America, there's the introduction of the flat fingerboard and then the turning pegs. And those introductions actually reflect the influence of the Spanish colonizers on America. And so another instrument that was popular among the enslaved Africans was the banjo. So this was a 4-string instrument that had sheepskin put over the a hollow calabash, and it was lengthened with a neck, and that instrument was usually used to give accompaniment to the drum. There was also a galan. That one is a 3-string gourd with a body. The body was made of a gourd, literally looked like a gourd, and that was from the culture of Kotoko in Chad and North Cameroon, and that was usually played with what they call gudu gudu. That is a hollowed piece of wood that was covered with animal skin, and that's a type of Yoruba drum that was very popular among the enslaved Africans. So all these things they used, and then they played with them together, and they sung and danced during their festivals. So a banjo from the one of the old plantations was seen, and it was what did they call it? It was examined. So one of the first features that they saw on that banjo, comparing it to now and trying to find the roots, was that it had a thumb string. And this thumb string was very common amongst the West African heritage, so it's traced back to have been, connected with that. And another feature is that it had a highly distinctive neck through body type of full spike construction. And that is seen to be very similar with the Afro-Jamaican strumps. So what that means is that the strumps have bodies that are not made out of wood; they're made of gourd. And in some cultures, like I said earlier, the Islam, some cultures use calabash, so either the gourd or the calabash. Another feature that is common among them is they have decorative sound holes cut into them. So sound holes, for the sounds to come out, either cut into like X's or S's or triangles or diamonds or crescents. You're just cut. The fourth feature that was seen on the banjo was the floating bipedal bridge. So this is like a thin, upright, horizontal piece with two distinct legs resting on the instrument's animal hide sound table, over which the strings are like lifted up and they pass from the peg head all the way down to the buddy's tail end. So this is linked to some part of West Africa because many of their spiked lutes look like this. They have this feature, so it was traced all the way back to West Africa. The fifth feature was that there was a tuning peg affixed with the strings. So there was a peg head at the top of the instrument and all the strings were connected to that all the way down. And it was found that this was like a European innovation into the banjo. And it was found that this distinguished the African American early gourd banjos from its West African antecedents. The sixth feature is a raised small piece at the top of the instrument's fingerboard and is called a nut. So this was made out of wood or bones, and this is also another non-West African feature. And the seventh is a tailpiece. So this is just basically at the end of the instrument's body, and as well another non-African tailpiece, because I guess it was used to like tie the strings together, but what the West Africans did was literally tie it. I don't know with what, but not a tailpiece. And so with the emergence of this wood-rimmed 5-string banjo around the 1840, the tailpieces became standard on all banjos, and so the emergence follows. The banjo is a prime example of how cultures interact to create something valuable. This instrument that stems from the African culture has now become largely known in South America and was very vital in creating one of the most famous forms of music, which we will soon touch on. There are various variations of the banjo. There's the molo, the accounting, the semi-spiked lutes, the full spiked lutes. You see, the mixing together of all these variations has resulted in a newer and more modern instrument today, such as the guitar and other string instruments, So things like the sound holes, the bipedal bridge, the tailpiece. Ring a bell? Hello? The violin, the cello, the guitar, ukulele, all of those things together. Many of these instruments have grown over the years and have associated themselves with a culture. Like the banjo, they've associated with the Appalachian region, the ukulele with the Hawaiians. This is the expansion of goods and ideas all around the world, and today we're benefiting from that. The orchestras and music bands that have instruments like the cello, the violin, all of that. The ideas that made those instruments came from other instruments of other cultures. Can't count how many times I've said instruments. So this is a crossing of culture that has happened ages ago, and we don't even realize that we're reaping all of that today. You see, the transatlantic slavery was the largest migration of people all around the globe. The Africans which were enslaved and transported to the Americas is what gave rise to what is now the African American culture. From 1670, when the first colonial settlement happened, to 1720, when they finally established the plantation in Carolina Low Country in South Carolina, the majority of the people grew, and it was majority of the enslaved people that were in South Carolina that were living there, you know. And it was majorly enslaved Africans, survivors of the Middle Passage, and the Afro Creoles. Those were the African descent who were born in the New World. So because of this growing number of the enslaved people and all of that, they created a Slave Act. And basically what this did was to prohibit slaves from being imported, like to stop any foreign ones from being imported into South Carolina. And also they had to like put some harsh regulations, like stopping them from playing drums and any loud music, and from wearing clothes that were not for them, made for them, I guess. So guess what this resulted in? A baby boom of their African American culture. Literally what it means, a baby boom, like baby boom. So guess what happened? The number was still growing, so they still ended up opening up the importation, so that continued. So ultimately what this led to was a confluence of various African American, European American, all of those traditions just coming together in this uniquely syncretic cultural gumbo that was early Afro-Carolinian music, dance, and material culture. This was seen in the depicted music instruments, their clothing, the kitchen vessels even. And what this does is just basically evidences the expansion of culture that was happening, the globalization that was just going on, that happened back then, and we can even see it now with the interaction of different cultures. Whew. I know y'all heard me say bluegrass when I first started this topic at the beginning, and you're wondering what was the correlation. If you're like me, when I first started world history, you're probably lost. But shout out to you, Dr. Banks. I'm no longer lost, I'm found. So, back to the point. What is bluegrass? First of all, I did a Google search and I typed the word banjo. So what came up was the most recent picture of a white man holding the banjo. So now, this is far from the history that we just talked about, because as we can see, that was an African thing. But this is the reality of what it is now. Like, the true history has gotten hidden over the years, and we're gonna talk about how that happened. The banjo arrived in Maryland and Virginia no later than 1740s. During the 18th century, when the banjo first appeared in North America, all the Scottish, and Irish immigrants began arriving in Pennsylvania in large numbers, and many of them were musicians who carried with them their recently standardized fiddles. So Africans were quick to learn it, and they played it for the whites, who soon became fond of it. So a report from the historian Cresswell said that a report from a historian read about Cresswell, who said, and I quote, "A great number of young people met together with a fiddle and banjo played by two Negroes with plenty of toddy, which both men and women seem to be very fond of." So basically what this quote is telling us is that the fiddle and the banjo were around at that time and they existed together. So the coexistence of these two instruments began about 740 is what the historians concluded on, and it would take about a century to blend and burst into the full minstrel of the old-time string music. So the cultural exchange that eventually led to the banjo becoming the symbol for the Appalachian region was when two young white boys, Ben Carter and Harry Willis, they were fascinated with the banjo that was being played by several African musicians outside, and so they joined them to sing and dance as they played their banjos. The black musicians continued to perform with their banjos. Although they got mocked by some white people as they did it, the popularity of the banjo grew, and there began musical exchange between the Africans, the Irish, and the Scots. And so by the third decade of the 19th century, whites, many of whom were Irish, began to take up banjo playing and to create minstrelsy. Many of the whites began to seek black mentors, whom they learned their playing skills from. Joe Walker Sweeney, that is one of the first white known banjo players, and he learned his music skills from enslaved Africans, probably workers in his family farm or something, as historians say. He created quite the popularity for the 5-string banjo. Dan Emmett was also another white person. He traveled with the Cincinnati Circus Company, and he convinced the company to hire Ferguson, who was a white banjo player. And so this also led to the transmission and transformation of the African music culture by these white musicians. And I know you may wonder why you've never really heard of black or African banjo players, because they were the ones who first started playing, and there were a lot of them in the early 20th century even, but like they were not documented. So by the end of the century, they were hardly remembered by the people who were there. And so with the emergence of the blues and record deals, record labels, and all of that, the black banjo, the black players, all of that began to decline. But of course, it was still popular with the whites, and it continued to grow. In the 1920s and 1930s, Bill Monroe, who is sitting in the In the 1920s and 1930s, Bill Monroe, who is sitting in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as the father of bluegrass music, began his band with his brothers. So they eventually split up, and then that caused him to start what is now his most popular reign as Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. So they started their band, and the type of music that they incorporated was songs and rhythms from string bands, gospel, both black and white, work songs and shout songs of black laborers, and country and blues music repertoires. So the main instruments that they used for these were the mandolin, the banjo, the fiddle, the guitar, and bass. So Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys was probably the breakthrough for the bluegrass music style, probably the most common and the one that reached the largest audience. And basically highlighted the popularity of the use of the banjo. But the roots that made all of this even possible is from an incorporation of different cultures, dialing all the way back from the transatlantic slavery to now.
Wow, that's so nice to know.